So now that we've talked about how we determine independent and dependent variables, we know that the y depends on the x. So y depends on x. So if he wants to know how much time it's going to take, then that is going to be dependent on any number of birdhouses that we put in our table. All right, so let's go ahead and put that into our table here with x and y, time in hours, and then we can go ahead and put the 7 birdhouses for 5 hours. So we did not say that it was the bigger number for y and the smaller number for x. In fact, this situation shows us that that is not true, but it is always going to be the dependent variable is y and the independent variable is x. Okay, so in order to write an equation, I know that the equation format is always, let's use a different color that stands out, y equals kx. Okay, so y equals kx. This is a proportional equation that we use every single time. And so in order to determine the equation that we're going to use, or the rule that we're going to use for the table, we need to figure out what k is. So if we start to think backwards, how do we find k? How do we find this constant of proportionality, or this constant multiplier going from x to y? Well, since I don't see that 7 goes into 5 evenly, like if using multiplication, in fact, it's getting smaller, I know that I can divide y divided by x always, right? I always divide y over x. And so in this case, it is 5 over 7. Awesome. So since this fraction can't be simplified, I can turn it into a decimal if I wanted, but realistically, I'm kind of okay with this fraction staying the way it is. So I'm just going to substitute that into my equation over here. And here is our equation, 5 over 7x. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's 5 over 7 what? What's our label? It's 5/7 of an hour for 1 birdhouse. Remember our unit rate, our constant multiplier. So if I put that into the table, 1 birdhouse would take about 5 over 7, or 5/7 of an hour. And I can double check that this is true, because 1 times 5 over 7 is 5/7, and 7 times 5 over 7 is 5. Okay, so now that we have our equation, we found that constant of proportionality, we're going to use it to start solving some different numbers of birdhouses to figure out the amount of hours. So for example, let's just say, right, even though this question is done, right, we did come up with the equation, I want to just see if I had 14 birdhouses, how can I figure out how much time it would take for him to build that using our equation? Well, I see that we have our equation y equals 5 over 7x. And in our table, I see that birdhouses is now the variable we have for x. So I'm going to substitute that into my equation. And now I'm going to multiply 5/7 times 14, just like we would have done in our table when we were looking at them like a week ago, right? We still use that constant multiplier to figure out what y was. But let's go ahead and review how to multiply fractions. So I see that 14 is a whole number. It isn't written as a fraction. So I remember that to make it a fraction, right, to rewrite it as a fraction, I need to have 14 over 1, so that when I simplify this fraction, it goes back to that whole number of 14. And then how do we multiply fractions again? We multiply straight across, so 14 times 5, and then 7 times 1, and we get 70 over 7. Now, can we simplify this fraction? Yep, we can. 70 divided by 7 is 10, so y equals 10, but more specifically, our label is 10 hours. So I can put that into our table here. And you may have come up with a different strategy to find this answer, but to stamp, this is how we would use our equation. When we are given a variable, right, when we're given x, we can substitute it for that variable and then solve. Let's go ahead and practice one on our own.